In forgotten sketches and overlooked margins lie the origins of stories that shape entire cultures. Today, we trace the strange path of Labubu, from an obscure drawing in Hong Kong to a global icon that unsettles, fascinates, and endures. This is Forgotten Chronicles, where we uncover the hidden histories behind the symbols of our age. Hong Kong, late 2000s. The city buzzed with neon and noise, a place where commercial art met underground subculture in uneasy harmony. Inside a small studio, far removed from the glittering skyline, illustrator Kasing Lung bent over his sketchbook. The room was silent, except for the faint scrape of pencil on paper. He was not drafting a product, not designing for the market. What he created that night was for no one but himself. A private note, an idle exercise of the imagination. Yet from the quiet of that moment emerged a figure that would not stay hidden. On the page appeared a creature with a grin that seemed to stretch too far. Its teeth were sharp, triangular, a detail too precise to be accidental. The eyes were round, oversized, reflecting both innocence and something darker. And its body, small, childlike, almost harmless in its proportions, only deepened the unease. The horns were perhaps the most unsettling feature, not grand like those of a beast, but stubby, almost playful. They crowned the figure like a warning disguised as decoration. Together, the features formed something that unsettled without explanation, a character that was not meant to comfort, nor fully to frighten. Lung, by his own admission, saw this sketch as just another of his many strange doodles. He had long been fascinated by European fairy tales, where goblins and tricksters lurked at the edges of forests, smiling before they deceived. The sketch belonged to that tradition, mischievous, ambiguous, alive with a tension between charm and menace. At that time, Hong Kong's art scene was experimenting with hybrid imagery, mixing East and West, cute and grotesque. In this environment, Lung's strange figure seemed like nothing more than a private curiosity. There were no plans for exhibitions, no toy companies waiting in the shadows. It was simply a drawing that lingered in a sketchbook, unfinished, unnamed, forgotten by its creator almost as soon as it appeared. But looking back, the essential DNA of Labubu was already there. The grin, impossibly wide, the teeth, sharp enough to suggest danger, the small frame, tempting the viewer to underestimate it. Even in this first appearance, the figure was complete in its contradictions, both endearing and unsettling, both childlike and monstrous. It was never meant to be more than a sketch, yet some creations resist their maker's intent. What Lung left on the page that night would not stay confined to ink and paper. It would resurface, altered and multiplied, traveling far beyond the quiet studio where it was born. The world had not yet named it. Collectors had not yet lined up for it. But in that dim studio in late 2000s Hong Kong, Labubu had already begun its long journey, from obscure drawing to global icon. Kasing Lung was not a designer in the conventional sense. He was an illustrator, a storyteller, and in many ways, a collector of shadows. Born in Hong Kong, Lung grew up surrounded by a city that thrived on contrasts. Gleaming skyscrapers pressed against decaying alleyways, innocence rubbing against corruption. This tension seeped into his art. Before Labubu, Lung had already carved out a name in underground circles. His early works circulated quietly, not through glossy advertisements or major galleries, but in small exhibitions, tucked away in spaces where the mainstream rarely looked. His audience was intimate, almost secretive, drawn to the way he blended whimsy with unease. They were not buying toys. They were witnessing fragments of darker stories hidden beneath the surface of playful lines. Lung's greatest influences did not come from the pop icons of Hong Kong, but from European fairy tales, stories that, in their original form, were far removed from the sanitized versions told to children today. He studied the darker layers of those narratives, witches who devoured, forests that deceived, goblins who smiled only to betray. In his hands those characters did not simply remain in their Western contexts. He transplanted their essence into new forms, creatures that looked disarmingly cute, but carried an unsettling presence just beneath the surface. This balance between charm and menace became his signature. His characters were not monstrous in appearance alone. They were more dangerous in their ambiguity, halfway between innocence and something corrupted. They reflected the kind of figures who, in old folklore, were not villains but tricksters, beings you could never fully trust, no matter how small or playful they appeared. The underground exhibitions that showcased Lung's work became laboratories for these ideas. In dimly lit spaces, surrounded by others who crave art outside the mainstream, his illustrations found a home. There, the creatures he drew were not confined to paper. They became part of whispered conversations, passed through zines, or exchanged in hushed tones between collectors of the unusual. These gatherings gave Lung freedom. Free from commercial demands, he refined his art into something distinct, not quite horror, not quite cute, but suspended uneasily between the two. By the late 2000s, his reputation had solidified among those who searched for the uncanny in art. He was not yet a global name, but his creations carried the marks of an artist who had learned to navigate shadows, someone who knew how to draw the viewer closer with innocence before unsettling them with menace. It was within this space, cultivated by fairy tales, folklore, and the underground art scene, that Labubu would later emerge. The sketch was not an accident nor a random doodle. It was the product of years spent exploring the strange intersection where wonder and dread coexist. In Lung's background, we find the soil in which Labubu's roots first took hold, dark, fertile, and waiting to grow. The sketch that would later be called Labubu might have remained a forgotten doodle, one among countless figures buried in an illustrator's notebook. But for Kasing Lung, certain images had a way of reappearing on page after page, as if demanding to exist. Labubu was one of them. At first, it appeared without name or purpose, a grin too wide and eyes too round resurfacing in the margins of Lung's work. The repetition was not deliberate marketing, it was instinct. Lung found himself sketching the same creature in new poses, giving it small variations, testing the weight of its horns, exaggerating its teeth. What began as a curiosity became a motif, a figure that refused to be erased. Over time, Labubu took on more than form. It began to acquire personality. Lung, steeped in folklore and drawn to trickster archetypes, infused the character with qualities that blurred the line between mischief and menace. Labubu was playful, yes, but never innocent. Its smile suggested secrets. Its teeth hinted at consequences. It was the kind of being who might appear harmless until the moment you trusted it, and then vanish with something you valued. In Lung's own stories, Labubu was not a hero. It did not rescue, nor did it destroy. It lingered in the shadows between those roles, always unpredictable, always a step removed from clear definition. In this ambiguity lay its power. Like the goblins of old tales, Labubu was neither ally nor enemy, but a constant reminder that the world is not as orderly as we wish to believe. This strange figure began to circulate in small ways, first among Lung's admirers in the underground art scene. Fans of his exhibitions noticed the recurring presence of the horned trickster with the unsettling grin. It stood out against his other work, catching attention even in collections of darker illustrations. They asked about it, requested prints, heard about the creature with the teeth. Slowly, Labubu moved from private sketch to shared image, gaining recognition not through mass exposure, but through the fascination of a niche audience who felt they had discovered something hidden. In these early days, Labubu was not yet the centerpiece of a franchise. It was a presence, a character without boundaries, appearing in illustrations, small paintings, and scattered across the margins of exhibitions. Yet its persistence was undeniable. What had started as a private sketch became a recurring entity, a figure Lung could not abandon, and his audience could not forget. By the time the name Labubu was spoken, the creature had already lived in many forms. It had been sketched, redrawn, reframed, and quietly adored by those who saw in it more than just a drawing. It had become a character, a trickster born from shadows, playfully menacing, waiting for a wider world to take notice. The partnership between Kasing Lung and Pop Mart marked the decisive shift that carried Labubu from the pages of an illustrator's sketchbook into the hands of a global audience. To understand the significance of this collaboration, one must first consider the trajectory of Pop Mart itself. Founded in Beijing in 2010, Pop Mart began as a small enterprise focused on lifestyle products before recognizing the latent demand for designer toys. The company capitalized on a growing collector culture in China, one fueled by a blend of nostalgia, artistry, and exclusivity. By the mid-2010s, Pop Mart had refined its model: blind box releases, limited runs, and strategic collaborations with artists whose work straddled the line between fine art and commercial product. In this environment, Labubu found its platform. The collaboration was not immediate. For years, Lung's character existed within the quieter currents of underground illustration and niche art exhibitions. Collectors familiar with his darker fairy tale imagery already recognized the peculiar figure, small, sharp-toothed, always grinning. Yet, without mass distribution, Labubu remained a symbol of subcultural recognition rather than mainstream phenomenon. The first official collaboration between Lung and Pop Mart emerged in the late 2010s as part of the company's push to establish dominance in Asia's rapidly expanding designer toy sector. For Pop Mart, Labubu offered something unusual. Unlike many of their partnerships, which emphasized bright and market-friendly aesthetics, Labubu's charm resided in contradiction. The figure was mischievous, unsettling, and at times grotesque, yet undeniably magnetic. This tension between menace and cuteness aligned perfectly with the sensibilities of an audience seeking more than surface-level design. Through Pop Mart's manufacturing and distribution infrastructure, Labubu could now exist in mass-produced form, its details preserved with precision. Blind box sets introduced the character to collectors who had never encountered Lung's earlier illustrations. The figure's expressions varied, sometimes playful, sometimes sinister, reinforcing its reputation as a trickster spirit within the designer toy landscape. The reception was immediate. Within months of release, Labubu figures sold out across major Asian markets, with secondary prices climbing rapidly. Collectors did not merely acquire a toy, they acquired a symbol of entry into a growing community. Social media platforms amplified this effect, turning each unboxing into a public performance of cultural affiliation. For Lung, the collaboration altered the trajectory of his career. What had once been personal sketches and limited exhibition works were now part of an international phenomenon. For Pop Mart, the success of Labubu confirmed the viability of darker, more complex designs within a market often dominated by the whimsical and the cute. Thus, the Pop Mart connection was more than a business arrangement. It was the moment when an underground character, born from private drawings in Hong Kong, became a global commodity. The mischievous grin, the sharp teeth, the ambiguous charm, all carried intact into mass culture, reshaped by the machinery of distribution, yet retaining the core of Lung's vision. Labubu was no longer just a sketch. It was a brand, a collectible, and a phenomenon. In the world of designer toys, scarcity is not an accident. It is a calculated mechanism that turns objects into symbols of desire, and Labubu's rise followed this pattern with precision. From its earliest releases under Pop Mart, the character was defined not only by its mischievous grin, but also by the deliberate difficulty of acquisition. The practice of limited drops became central to Labubu's identity. Rather than flooding the market, Pop Mart structured releases in small quantities, distributed through blind box systems or timed events. This strategy served a dual function. First, it created an atmosphere of urgency, forcing collectors to act immediately or risk exclusion. Second, it cultivated an aura of mystique around the character. To own a Labubu figure was not only to appreciate Kasing Lung's vision, but also to signal one's success in navigating the highly competitive release system. Early records of these drops reveal their effectiveness. The Labubu Forest series, one of the first blind box sets, vanished from shelves within days of release. Subsequent editions, such as the Labubu Fairy Tale and Labubu Monster series, followed the same trajectory, selling out with remarkable speed. Secondary markets began to reflect this scarcity. Prices doubled, tripled, and in some cases multiplied further as collectors competed for pieces no longer available through official channels. This transformation altered the nature of the Labubu community. Initially, admirers approached the figure as a work of art, an extension of Lung's darker fairy tale aesthetic. Yet, as limited editions became rarer and aftermarket values rose, a new layer of meaning emerged. Labubu was no longer simply an object of artistic appreciation. It became an investment. Collectors began tracking release calendars with forensic attention. Dedicated forums, social media groups, and resale platforms. Mrs. documented each drop, cataloguing variations in colorway, expression, and series theme. Discussions shifted from interpretation of character traits to analysis of value trajectories. Which edition would retain its worth? Which variant would climb in price? This financialization of Labubu echoed larger trends within global collector culture. Designer toys, once the province of underground art enthusiasts, increasingly resembled commodities within speculative markets. For some, this shift was disillusioning. The intimacy of Lung's original sketches seemed distant when figures were flipped for profit within hours of release. Yet for others, the scarcity and investment potential only heightened Labubu's mystique, transforming it into an object at the intersection of art, culture, and capital. The limited edition model also reinforced Labubu's paradoxical identity. Just as the figure itself embodied contradictions, cute yet menacing, playful yet unsettling, the releases embodied duality. They were both accessible, as blind boxes priced within reach of many, and inaccessible, as the most coveted editions remained elusive. This duality ensured that Labubu could remain both a mass-produced commodity and an exclusive treasure. By the end of the 2010s, the pattern was firmly established. Each release was an event. Each edition, no matter how small, contributed to the growing mythology. Scarcity was no longer just a business strategy. It was a narrative force, weaving Labubu deeper into the cultural imagination. Labubu's grin remained unchanged, but its meaning had multiplied. The trajectory of Labubu did not remain confined to Hong Kong or even mainland China. By the early 2010s, its influence began to radiate outward, following the networks of collectors, toy fairs, and art conventions that defined the global designer toy market. What had started as a sketch in Kasing Lung's notebook was now crossing cultural boundaries, carried by both Pop Mart's distribution strategy and the organic spread of collector enthusiasm. Asia was the first domain of expansion. Taiwan and Japan embraced Labubu with notable enthusiasm. In Japan, the character's mixture of cuteness and menace resonated with traditions of yokai folklore and with an established culture of collectible mascots. In Taiwan, the darker fairy tale aesthetic found a ready audience among younger collectors already familiar with limited edition toy culture. These early expansions solidified Labubu's reputation as more than a regional curiosity. Europe followed soon after. Exhibitions in Paris and Berlin introduced Labubu to audiences steeped in traditions of surrealism and underground illustration. The reception was markedly different. Whereas Asian collectors often emphasized the playful or cute dimensions of the figure, European critics were more attuned to the grotesque. They read Labubu not as a toy, but as a commentary on the fractured innocence of childhood. For them, the wide grin and sharp teeth were symbols of distortion, not merely decoration. North America became the final major frontier. Designer toy conventions in Los Angeles and New York provided the setting. Here, Labubu entered a market already dominated by vinyl toy pioneers such as Kidrobot. Yet its distinctive blend of mischief and menace set it apart. American collectors, many of them drawn from street art and lowbrow illustration scenes, interpreted Labubu as part of a globalized counterculture. The figure's limited avait, lability and its association with Kasing Lung's underground art credentials ensured that it was received as authentic rather than commercial. The role of large-scale exhibitions cannot be overlooked. Pop Mart strategically staged Labubu at international conventions, from Shanghai Toy Show to Designer Con in California. These events provided not only sales opportunities, but also moments of myth-making. Entire exhibition halls were given over to elaborate displays, presenting Labubu in forests, castles, and fairy tale landscapes. Each staging reinforced the idea that the figure was more than a toy. It was the central figure of a narrative world. The cultural reception varied by region, but the effect was cumulative. Labubu became a global icon precisely because it could be read differently. In Asia, it was playful, mischievous, and tied to kawaii aesthetics. In Europe, it carried weight as surrealist commentary. In North America, it was a countercultural collectible. These multiple interpretations did not fracture the brand. Instead, they expanded it, allowing different communities to claim ownership while maintaining the shared recognition of Labubu's distinctive form. By the late 2010s, Labubu had completed its transformation from obscure sketch to international figure. Exhibitions, conventions, and collector networks had carried it far beyond its origin. Its grin now looked out not only from sketchbooks and art shows, but from global stages, where its presence marked the convergence of art, commerce, and culture. Labubu's enduring presence cannot be explained solely through scarcity or distribution strategy. The figure's form itself carries a symbolic weight, drawing on visual archetypes that reach deep into cultural memory. Its horns, teeth, and eyes are not arbitrary embellishments, but design choices that echo long-standing traditions of trickster and monster imagery. The horns are perhaps the most immediate marker. In European folklore, small horned creatures often appeared as goblins or forest imps, beings tied not to absolute evil, but to mischief, unpredictability, and boundary crossing. Horns suggested otherness, a departure from the human form, a signal that the creature existed outside ordinary order. Labubu's horns function in the same way, framing its head with a subtle but constant reminder of its strangeness. The sharp teeth accentuate this impression. In many cultural traditions, exaggerated dentition signifies danger, while simultaneously producing comic effect. Japanese yokai lore contains numerous examples, creatures whose oversized mouths and jagged smiles are both threatening and absurd. Kasing Lung's decision to render Labubu's grin with such intensity transforms the figure into something paradoxical, approachable yet dangerous, humorous yet unsettling. The smile is wide, but it is not innocent. Equally central are the eyes. Enlarged and round, they are characteristic of childhood imagery, recalling innocence, curiosity, and vulnerability. Yet when combined with horns and teeth, they destabilize rather than reassure. The viewer is confronted with a creature that embodies both infantile softness and predatory menace. This contrast explains much of Labubu's impact. It does not commit to either pole. Instead, it exists in tension, simultaneously attracting and repelling. Comparative folklore studies show similar patterns. The European goblin, the Japanese yokai, and numerous forest trickster figures in global mythology occupy the same ambiguous space. They are rarely mortal threats. Instead, they disrupt, unsettle, and invert expectations. They remind human communities of the instability of their own order. Labubu belongs to this lineage, consciously or unconsciously reproducing archetypes that audiences recognize even without explicit reference. The unsettling attraction of Labubu lies precisely in this ambiguity. Viewers are not drawn to it in spite of its contradictions, but because of them. The character is designed to evade resolution. Is it a monster or a mascot? A menace or a companion? The answer shifts depending on the angle of perception, the cultural background of the observer, or even the lighting of an exhibition hall. This instability makes Labubu durable as a cultural symbol. Unlike figures tied to fixed roles, it can be reinterpreted indefinitely. Collectors in Asia may read it as mischievous, recalling playful spirits. European audiences may frame it as grotesque commentary. American fans may embrace it as a countercultural icon. The design permits all readings without collapsing into a single narrative. Thus, Labubu is unsettled yet attractive. Its grin promises mischief, its horns signal strangeness, its eyes demand empathy. Together, these features weave a figure that is not comfortably one thing or another. In that ambiguity lies its power, sustaining its fascination across regions, markets, and generations. Labubu's expansion into global markets brought with it a distinct collector culture, documented not only in sales records, but in the behaviors of fans who sought to obtain it. The phenomenon cannot be separated from the blind box system, nor from the patterns of scarcity that shaped how collectors organized themselves around the figure. Archival traces describe the long lines that became a fixture at Pop Mart events. At conventions in Shanghai, Tokyo, and Los Angeles, attendees queued for hours before release, often without certainty of securing a figure. Photographs of these gatherings show not simply consumer activity, but ritualized participation. To stand in line became a marker of belonging, proof of commitment to the community surrounding Labubu. The resale market quickly reinforced this culture. Platforms such as Xianyu in China, Yahoo Auctions in Japan, and eBay in the United States documented sharp spikes in value for rare editions. Figures retailing for modest sums often doubled or tripled in price within days. Auction records from the late 2010s note instances where limited Labubu variants exceeded the equivalent of several hundred US. Collectors began to track these values with forensic precision, treating each figure as both art object and commodity. Parallel to this financial dimension was the formation of fan communities. Online forums and social media groups dedicated to Labubu multiplied. Members posted photographs of their collections, exchanged information about upcoming drops, and offered strategies for maximizing chances of obtaining rare editions. In many cases, the emphasis shifted from individual figures to the pursuit of full sets. To complete a series became an objective in itself, a task requiring persistence, trade, and sometimes substantial expenditure. The blind box system intensified this behavior. Each purchase carried uncertainty, the possibility of repetition, or the elusive chance of drawing the secret variant. Collectors documented the opening of boxes, often recording videos that combined suspense with disappointment or triumph. Over time, the ritual of unboxing became as central to the culture as the figures themselves. This pursuit produced forms of obsession. Accounts describe individuals purchasing entire cases of blind boxes in hopes of securing every edition. Others resorted to trading networks, arranging exchanges across continents to fill gaps in their collections. The language of completeness and sets grew common, suggesting that the allure was not tied to a single Labubu, but to the idea of totality. Auction values and resale records provide one measure of this culture. The behavior of fans offers another. Both reveal a pattern in which Labubu transcended its role as a toy. It became a social object, binding individuals into networks of desire, competition, and community. For some, the experience was marked by camaraderie, as groups formed to assist one another in the pursuit. For others, it was marked by frustration, exclusion, or financial strain. By the end of the decade, Labubu's collector culture stood as one of the most visible in the designer toy field. It demonstrated how scarcity, ritual, and community could converge around a single figure, ensuring that Labubu was not simply owned, but pursued, discussed, and mythologized. By the end of the 2010s, Labubu had moved beyond its commercial origins. What began as a private sketch and later as a mass-produced collectible was increasingly recognized as a cultural artifact. This transition was marked by its entry into museum spaces, academic discussions, and art criticism that situated it within broader traditions of contemporary visual culture. Exhibitions played a decisive role in this reclassification. In Beijing and Shanghai, Pop Mart staged displays that blurred the line between commercial showcase and art installation. Visitors did not encounter figures in packaging, but rather in elaborate environments, forest dioramas, castle interiors, and fairy tale landscapes, constructed to highlight the characters' mythic qualities. European institutions, including smaller galleries in Paris and Berlin, began to feature Labubu alongside fine art and contemporary sculpture. In these contexts, the figure was reframed not as merchandise, but as cultural commentary, sharing wall space with works of surrealist and postmodern artists. Critical discourse soon followed. Academic essays and design journals documented Labubu within the framework of cute horror aesthetics. The juxtaposition of large, innocent eyes with sharp teeth and menacing horns was not dismissed as novelty, but analyzed as a deliberate destabilization of childhood iconography. Scholars compared the figure to Japanese yokai traditions, to European fairy tale grotesques, and to contemporary practices of blending innocence with menace. Labubu, they argued, embodied the contradictions of late modern consumer culture, a product simultaneously playful and unsettling, designed for both children and adults, mass-produced yet exclusive. In conferences dedicated to visual culture, Labubu was cited as an example of how designer toys occupy hybrid spaces between art and commodity. Unlike traditional sculptures, its form was multiplied in thousands of units. Unlike ordinary toys, its scarcity, exhibitions, and symbolic weight placed it in dialogue with fine art. This duality, mass object and cultural artifact, became central to understanding its appeal. Collectors and curators alike began to emphasize this redefinition. Display cases in private homes increasingly resembled galleries, carefully arranged and lit to highlight Labubu as centerpiece. At the same time, institutions experimented with placing Labubu alongside traditional artworks, testing the boundaries of what could be included in the category of museum-worthy. The reception was divided. Some critics resisted the elevation of a commercial figure to the level of art, dismissing it as a marketing strategy disguised as cultural relevance. Others embraced it as evidence of shifting hierarchies, where the distinctions between high and low culture no longer held. Regardless of position, the debate itself signaled that Labubu had achieved a new level of recognition. It was no longer confined to the shelves of collectors or the booths of conventions. It has entered the spaces where culture defines itself. As a cultural artifact, Labubu represents more than a character. It embodies a moment in global culture where cuteness and menace coexist, where mass production and exclusivity intertwine, and where the boundaries between art, commodity, and folklore dissolve. Its grin, once confined to the page of a sketchbook, now gazes from within the halls of galleries and the texts of academic discourse. The story of Labubu begins in obscurity. A single drawing in the late 2000s, rendered by Kasing Lung, without thought of mass appeal or cultural permanence. At the time, it was little more than a personal experiment, an image carrying traces of mischief, menace, and whimsy. No product was envisioned, no strategy outlined. Yet in the years that followed, this private sketch moved steadily outward, step by step, from notebook to exhibition, from collectible to symbol. The transformation was not immediate. It passed first through repetition, as Lung returned to the image until it assumed the form of a character. From there, the collaboration with Pop Mart expanded its reach, placing Labubu into blind boxes and retail displays. Scarcity turned desire into ritual. Collectors gathered in long lines, traded duplicates, and measured their success by the completeness of their sets. What began as admiration for art shifted into the logic of investment. Global expansion followed. Asia provided fertile ground, with Japan and Taiwan recognizing Labubu's resonance with traditions of folklore and cute horror aesthetics. Europe offered a more surrealist interpretation, reading the figure as grotesque commentary. North America incorporated it into a countercultural lineage of designer toys. Across these contexts, the reception varied. but the figure adapted, always maintaining its ambiguous presence, childlike yet threatening, humorous yet unsettling. By the late 2010s, Labubu was no longer only a toy. It was installed in elaborate exhibitions, displayed alongside contemporary art, and analyzed in academic discourse. Its horns, teeth, and wide eyes became subjects of interpretation, linked to goblins, yokai, and trickster archetypes. Critics debated its meaning, while collectors built communities around it, reinforcing its presence as both object of desire and symbol of cultural hybridis. In this way, Labubu assumed the status of a cultural artifact. It stood at the intersection of art and commodity, folklore and commerce, innocence and menace. Few figures of the 21st century encapsulated this convergence so fully. Its journey illustrates how a single drawing, initially without intent or audience, could evolve into an international icon, sustained by scarcity, ritual, and symbolic ambiguity. The archival record of Labubu is one of transformation. From sketch to motif, from underground exhibitions to Pop Mart collaborations, from local fan groups to global communities, its trajectory maps the shifting boundaries of contemporary culture. It is evidence of how art can emerge from commerce, and how commerce, in turn, can elevate art. As the second decade of the 21st century closed, Labubu occupied spaces once reserved for established artistic traditions. Museums, academic journals, and collector markets all engaged with the figure. In its grin and its horns, in its balance of menace and charm, Labubu came to symbolize the contradictions of its era. Mass-produced yet scarce, playful yet unsettling, commercial yet cultural. From forgotten drawing to global icon, the arc is complete. Labubu's presence endures not simply as a collectible, but as a symbol of how images migrate, evolve, and take root in the shared imagination of a century. From a single sketchbook page to international museums, Labubu's journey reflects how myths are made in the 21st century. If you found this chronicle revealing, support the archive by subscribing to Forgotten Chronicles. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Does Labubu's smile charm you or unsettle you? Until next time, remember, the stories we overlook are often the ones that last the longest.